Hello everyone, and thank you for attending Cable Next Gen Europe 2024, Embracing Cable Fibre Coexistence Digital Symposium, Day 1, Session 1, It's All About Access. I would like to thank our platinum sponsors, Bessemer, and a thank you to our gold sponsors Harmonic and Technetix. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. On the left-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, please type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Near the end of today's presentation, please take 1 minute to complete the survey that's open on your screen. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Heavy Reading's Cable Video Practice Leader, Alan Bresnick.
All right. Thank you, Becky. Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our 7th annual Cable Next Gen Europe conference and the 5th one that we're doing digitally. We're delighted you could be with us today. As Becky noted, my name is Alan Bresnick. I'm the Cable Video Practice Leader at Heavy Reading, based outside Toronto, Canada. I specialize in the cable, broadband, and video technology markets. I put together this conference in conjunction with our 3 sponsors, our 5 media partners, a dozen or so speakers, and several of my fellow analysts, and our marketing, sales, and project management teams. Okay, so before we get started, please note that the slides will advance automatically throughout the session, as Becky noted. If you wish, you can download a copy of the slides at any time just by clicking on the Additional Resources button, which is located below the presentation window. As during our webinars, we will have an audience question and answer session at the end of each panel if time permits. You can take part in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time. Just type your question into the Ask a Question area and then click the Submit button. Okay, so let me first give a quick shout out to our sponsors and industry partners. They include our premium sponsor, Bessemer, and our 2 gold sponsors, Technetix and Harmonic. Then here is our 5 industry partners, as you can see on the screen here, and I just need to turn my page. Cable Labs, SCTE, CTAM Europe, Omdia, and Telecoms.com, as well as the Deloro Group. We couldn't put on this webinar without their gracious and generous support. Okay, so we have a great deal to share and discuss over the next 3 or so hours. So let's quickly look at today's agenda. Right now, I'm doing the welcome to you. Then we'll have our first keynote from John Chapman talking about the future of broadband. Then we'll have our platinum sponsor keynote from Ryan Nicometto. Then we move on to our first panel, which is cable enabling cable fiber coexistence. And I'm sorry, that's what the keynote sponsor, the platinum keynote, is about. And then our panel is all about access. Then we take a 15-minute break, and then we come back for our keynote from one of my Omdia colleagues about the European broadband outlook. We have another keynote from Vodafone, and then we have our fireside chat with Bill Warger from Liberty Global. Then we have our second panel of the day, making broadband networks more efficient. And finally, we wrap up at the end of that session. Okay, so let's start by taking a quick glimpse at an opening slide from my colleague, Julia Schindler's presentation later today. As you can see here, fiber has now become the largest broadband delivery technology in Europe, displacing DSL. And fiber will continue to drive subscription growth over at least the next 4 years, leaving both DSL and HFC in the dust. Julia will go through these in a lot more detail later on. I just wanted to give you a taste of what's to come. Okay, so as a result of this, in a corresponding trend, European service providers spending on PON equipment over fiber is slated to start taking off again this year after slipping a bit last year. As this slide shows from another one of my Omdia colleagues, Jamie Lederman, it shows that annual European spending on PON gear is projected to soar to more than $3.5 billion annually in 2028 and 2029. So we'll be talking a lot about that, especially in the first panel. In stark contrast, European service provider spending on DOCSIS-related equipment is expected to rise only slightly over the next 4 years after falling over the past 2 years. As this slide from our friend Jeff Hainan and Delora Group shows, minimal spending growth on DOCSIS products is expected through 2028 as providers invest more in fiber network builds instead. As I said, we'll get into a lot more detail about that on our first panel. At the same time, DAA momentum will transform the cable market as the cable industry is moving steadily, making steady progress towards its 10G goal and beyond by rolling out distributed access architecture, or DAA technology. By moving key management functions and intelligence from the central cable head end to the access network, DAA makes it possible for operators to boost the capacity of their systems and thereby deliver higher speeds and better service than before. As a result, our colleagues at Omdia project the next-gen DAA-related technologies will generate nearly $800 million annually this year and account for 75% of global cable access component equipment revenues by next year. Okay, here's one of my favorite slide. Given all these trends, how are European cable operators striving to reach the industry's 10G goal, the goal of providing 10 gigabit service, at least in the downstream, to their subscribers? Well, as you can see on this chart, they're going about it in all sorts of different ways. Some operators are upgrading their legacy HFC networks to DOCSIS 3.1 or enhanced DOCSIS 3.1 and DOCSIS 4.0. Others are standing pat on DOCSIS and deploying fiber wherever they can. And still others are taking a more nuanced hybrid approach by upgrading to higher orders of HFC and DOCSIS in some areas while installing fiber and PON in other areas. We'll examine all these various approaches and more in our presentations, our panels, and fireside chats today. So please hang in there and stay with us for the next 3 hours. Then here's my last opening slide for the day. It summarizes the cable industry's new push to embrace fiber builds through standards work that has been started at Cable Labs. We have Kevin Nolan here, and he's going to be talking in more detail about this later today. But as you can see here, Cable Labs has set up 2 new fiber to the premise working groups. They set them up back in October. The first group is focusing on optical operations and maintenance, while the second group is seeking to specify a DOCSIS framework for provisioning ITU-based PON technology, which is GPON, XGS-PON, and the various PONs that will come after that. There are 6 pillars of activity, as you can see here, spelled out, and Cable Labs is working with its subsidiaries, Curio and SCT, on this effort. Okay, so that's our preview. So let's now bring in our first keynoter. He's a legend in our time, John Chapman, otherwise known as one of the foremost creators of DOCSIS and numerous other and innovative cable technologies. Good morning, John. Thanks for joining us bright and early there. John, are you with us? We can't hear you, or at least I can't hear you.
There we go. How's that?
Okay, now we hear you, yes.
All right.
Should I go back to your first slide, John?
Yep.
Okay, hold on. Here you go.
Great. All right, let's go. So thanks everybody for joining us. What I'd like to talk about today is trends in the broadband arena and how we can use those trends to predict the future. How would you like to know where we've got, where we're going? And it would be a surprise to find out it actually is based upon where we've come from. So let's get right to it. How is broadband doing today? Let's jump to the next slide. Well, it turns out, next slide. So the broadband provision speed tiers, we have a little bit of a slide flipping problem on my side. So Alan, yeah, there we go. So it turns out over 1/3 of subscribers these days are, let's go back a slide, Alan, to the provision broadband speed tiers slide. 1/3 of the people today are taking gigabit service. 1/3. Back one slide, Alan. It used to be that we end up having maybe 5 or 10% in the top tier, not 33%, but it's 1/3. And this is on a worldwide basis. These numbers are taken from OpenVault. But just to collaborate that, in a light reading article in April 2024, Comcast, 1/3 of their top subscribers are taking a gigabit. So are we actually not fast enough? Do we actually need another top tier speed above 1 gigabit? So let's jump to the next slide. We're going to go to the one that says, how much is too much? So really, a gigabit. Like, does anybody really need a gigabit? I mean, seriously, why do people need a gigabit? What are the apps that are driving it? What if I told you we don't know what the apps are that are driving a gigabit? You know, wasn't 50 megabits per second good enough? I mean, if you take all the video that somebody's going to absorb, and that really adds up to about 20, maybe 30 megabits per second. I mean, 50 megabits per second is the speed of an E3 or a DS3 link, for those of you guys who remember back in the old telco days. That's a lot of bandwidth. But notice how many people have a gigabit. So I would put to you, we're not done. What observations can we walk away from this? And that is a couple. One, people will buy what they don't need if the price is right. I mean, I think we could argue that everything could fit inside 50 to 100 megabit, and yet 1/3 of the market is taking a gigabit, and that cannot be ignored. So people will buy things they don't need if the price is right. And what is really going on here is we have the technology to generate a gigabit. It's not much more money to generate a gigabit than it is 100 megabit. That is where technology is at. So technology permits, competition drives it, and the market accepts. And the applications, well, they will spawn to fill the gap. Somebody's going to figure out how to use that gigabit. But the technology permits, competition drives it, and the market accepts. So in a competition, in a competitive market, access speeds are really supply side driven. What technology can supply, not demand side driven. And the reality is in order to prevent subscriber loss and to remain competitive, it's the operators that need the higher speeds, actually more than the consumers do. If you're an operator and you're not supplying a gigabit per second, you've given up at least 1/3 of your potential market. Moving to the next slide. Now let's put it in perspective. I am going to avoid trying to figure out what that magic application is because I don't think it really matters. But let's put a gigabit into perspective. So I'm on the Wi-Fi slide. Here's a very simple version of the network. On the left, we have the cloud. In the middle, we have some broadband access network. It could be cable, it could be PON. On the right's your home network. On that right-hand side, it's a Wi-Fi environment. And Wi-Fi today is, it's about a gigabit per second. Technically, if you add up all the bands, Wi-Fi 5 is about 7 gigabits. But take a look at the progression that's coming in the marketplace. Wi-Fi 6 is 10 gigabits. Wi-Fi 7 is 46 gigabits. Wi-Fi 8 is 100 gigabits per second, right? If you go over on the left-hand side, we have servers up in the cloud that connect with 100 gigabits. And usually when you do a query response, it's multiple servers responding to you. So it's multiple 100 gigabits per second. Those servers are moving to 800 gigabits of connectivity. So we really have a cloud that is moving to terabit capable, a home network that's moving to 100 gig capability. And that broadband access network in the middle is at a gigabit. So it's 1% of what the home network is and 1/10 of 1% of what the cloud network is, right? So it is actually the bottleneck. At a gigabit per second, it is the impending bottleneck. So remember, it's the relativeness is important. And it's at above 50 megabit, it's not about bulk bandwidth. It's really about latency. It's about how it feels. It's about how quick things really move. 100 gigabits, when it comes, will be 100 times faster than 1 gigabit. And I think down the road, it's not going to be about that killer application that you or I see. It's really, I think future broadband communication is going to be needed for machine-to-machine communications. When you've got the large language model in the cloud and a small language model in your desktop, and that small language model is scrambling to find the answer for you and talking to Big Brother and going back and forth, I think that's where gigabit and above speeds are really going to shine. All right, let's move to the next slide. In a longer version of this presentation, I go through 10 different trends that support the growth of broadband. I'd like to share with you today just one of those trends, and that is the growth of ASICs. On this bottom slide, we see a whole bunch of ASICs from routers. You could just focus on the timeline and on that red line, which talks about the switching capacity of these chips. Just think about this for a moment. So if we go along and we look at 2018, there's a 12 terabit chip there. What is 12 terabits? It's 32 ports of 400 gig, all which fit into a 1 rack unit pizza box. Now, that's not even the latest one. That's an easy one to kind of wrap your head around. But there is boxes out now that have 50 terabit per second chips in there. 50 terabits. So that works out to 64 ports of 800 gig. 64 ports of 800 gig, all connected to one ASIC. There's more optics in that box than there is router electronics. This is incredible bandwidth, and this bandwidth is being developed to support data center applications. It's being built, designed, debugged, shipped in the market, and the NRE is being worked through in the data center market. This technology is going to land in the core 20 years from now. But let me just give you an example of these types, the bandwidth of these boxes. Let's jump to the next slide. Let's say everybody in Europe had 3 gigs of DOCSIS, so 2 OFDM channels. I worked out the numbers here on the right for Portugal, on the left for Colorado. One 400 gig port in that older box on the left is enough for all of Colorado or all of Portugal. As a matter of fact, that ASIC, an ASIC that looks this size, right, sitting in one of those boxes, one of these has enough bandwidth to backhaul DOCSIS for all of Europe. Now, it could be DOCSIS or broadband. I happen to use DOCSIS as an example, but let's say everybody has access to a 3 gigabit per second broadband service. This one ASIC will take care of all of Europe. And the USA is about half of this ASIC. So if you knew that there's that much bandwidth in the core and it's coming to the edge, how does that impact your plan? So there's more bandwidth in the core than the access can use. How will this excess bandwidth really impact the residential broadband market going forward? Let's go to the next slide. So for years, I've been fascinated by the growth of Ethernet, and the growth of Ethernet has been driven by the growth in ASICs. And so it's an excellent use case example. On the left, we have the growth of Ethernet over the years. The observation I've run with forever is that there was a 10x growth in Ethernet in 7 years. So it takes roughly 7 years to go from 1 gig to 10 gig, 10 gig to 100 gig, 100 gig to a terabit. It's been following that growth curve. Now, it's not always exactly 7 years. It's plus or minus a couple of years. And so that's the observation part. As I was preparing for this presentation, I checked in with Moore's Law, which is 2x growth in 2 years. And Moore's Law is what drives silicon. That's 4x in 4 years, 8x in 6 years. It's about 10x in 7 years. And 10x in 7 years is 100x in 14 years. It's 1,000x in 20 years. And that is generational growth. 1,000x bandwidth in 20 years. And the CAGR in that is about 41%. And we've seen between 30 and 50% in the broadband market. So that is the right median between those two. Ethernet directly benefits from the ASIC density. ASIC density is not slowing down. Therefore, I put forth that the bandwidth of the network is going to continue to increase. So this brings me to pull this observations together into 3 laws of broadband. So I'm now on the next slide. So the first law is the one we just covered right now. Internet speeds increase 1,000x every 20 years. Why? Technology permits, competition drives it, the market accepts, applications spawn to fill the gap. This is generational growth. The second law is that core technology leads access technology. Technology is developed and deployed in the core, the internet core. When it's mature and low cost, it can be used in the access. So When we were at a megabit at the edge, we had a gigabit in the core. We have a gigabit at the edge today. We have terabit in the core. The third law is in a competitive market, access speed is supply side driven, not demand side driven. Operators need the higher speeds more than the consumers to be competitive and to prevent subscriber loss. So with these three rules, let's move to the next slide and put this on a timeline. So here I've put together on a timeline the various bandwidths for PON, DOCSIS, DSL, ISDN, and dial-up as they move from, let's say, a megabit to a gigabit as DOCSIS has done. I then lined up those speeds with years. So as an anchor point, I would say that we hit a gigabit service offering in around 2020. And I remember when we hit a megabit service offering back in the year 2000. That was really when we celebrated that we bypassed DSL, was 20 years ago. You can see ISDN and dial-up there, and certainly if you go back to 1980 with dial-up modems, we had 1200 baud modems, which is the kilobit. So we can see the 20 years going from a kilobit to a megabit to a gigabit, and if that continues, if we believe in that progression, in 2040, 20 years from now, roughly, we're going to be at a terabit in the access. The data tells us we're going to be a terabit in the access. And that terabit, that 20 years, remember, is broken into 3 7-year zones, right? So we're in the zone right now of 1 gigabit to 10 gigabit. You have to have 1 gigabit to be a serious provider, but you don't need 10 gigabits. Once 100 gig PON ships, we'll officially move into the next zone where you really need that 10 gigabits as your entry level, but you don't need 100 gigabits yet. You need something in that spread between the two. So moving to the next slide. That's a lot of bandwidth. So how does DOCSIS and cable and everything fit in there? I think the first realization that you're going to see a lot of in today's presentation is that fiber is winning out in all the technologies. Here's a graph that shows fiber being ahead of cable by a few percentage points. What's interesting is DSL is still hanging in there 20 years after we kicked it to the curve. And so it really tells us and illustrates that legacy networks stick around for a long time. And I think we should expect DOCSIS and HFC to stick around for the next 10 to 20 years. But they're going to coexist with different investments and different value propositions. And we need to look at the network differently. The way that in cable we've been looking at the network has been a DOCSIS first DOCSIS first fiber second thing. So let's go build a fiber node and let's put a PON OLT inside of it. That's a great example of DOCSIS first fiber second thinking. We need to shift, I believe, to a fiber first DOCSIS second. The example there would be, let's build a world-class middle mile network that extends to the neighborhood with full redundancy. Let's put full services on it, and one of those services happens to be remote PHY. That's a fiber first DOCSIS second mentality. It's just that every time you spend $1 on something, you ask yourself, how does that impact my fiber network? And then you ask, how it impacts my DOCSIS network. So we're really at an inflection point between the maturing of DOCSIS and the inevitability of fiber. And so our challenge really is all about managing a graceful and pragmatic transition from DOCSIS to fiber. And this will be a slow shift over fiber 10 or 20 years. It's already happened a lot in Europe, and it is starting to happen in the United States. So we need to shift our thinking to from a DOCSIS first to fiber first. And quite honestly, if we look at ourselves, this will require a cultural change. So for example, in fiber, we should be putting money into middle mile access out to the edge. But a good example of spending on HFC might be the automation of calibration and maintenance of the amps so that the network has a lower OpEx envelope associated with it. So last slide on summary. What's an operator to do? Well, the operator should do what they have always done and focus on what is the service that they're offering and focus less on what is the actual medium that takes you there. The best strategy for a communication service provider, which is all of the operators out there, is to build a world-class network, middle mile initially, a solid IP network, followed by a competitive last mile, differentiate with the best throughput, the best quality, the best reliability, the best content aggregation, because really that's where things started at, and the best service aggregation, which is where things are going. and do so at a market competitive price point. If you can do that, you'll be the operator that is building and delivering that terabit service in 2040. Thank you very much.
Okay, John, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. A quick question for you: do you see more versions of DOCSIS being necessary after DOCSIS 4.0, or do you see it just not making sense as operators shift over to full fiber?
I think that the challenge for operators is to switch over to full fiber, but I think that
Okay.
journey, especially in our large networks, could be a 10 or 20-year journey. And so I do think that we're going to have newer technologies in DOCSIS, and those could be applied. So the challenge, I think the mistake would be, let's put every single penny we have into upgrading the cable network to the latest version of DOCSIS and chase it. I think the test has to be, how do I, you know, if I'm going to do a fiber network over 20 years, that's 5% a year. How do I invest 5% a year in my fiber network and keep the other rest, you know, the 95% or 90% or 80% of those customers happy? And I think that does lead to more advanced DOCSIS development, but it needs to be done not in a complete rebuild way. There needs to be sanity and cost checking associated with it. I've long felt that, you know, with DOCSIS sitting there at 100% of the market, as a DOCSIS person, I'd be happy at 80% of the market or 70% of the market. That's a huge amount of market share. So it needs to be managed properly. The spend needs to be done well. I would encourage that whatever upgrade that is done to the DOCSIS network, the question is asked is, can this be my last upgrade? How can this take me, you know, if I upgrade the HFC, can I get 1 or 2 revs or 3 revs of DOCSIS upgrades into that network? And right now, those are tightly coupled. They used to be loosely coupled. We used to be able to upgrade DOCSIS as upgrading the network. How do we get back to that paradigm?
Okay, fair enough. This all seems, the way you presented it all seems inevitable that we'll just keep having more and more capacity. What could stop that from happening?
You know, I think it's inevitable to get to a terabit. It seems crazy, and to be honest, one of my reasons
seem crazy
to challenge people's thinking, but yeah. I've got it sandbagged because that terabit technology, it already exists. The backbone's already running at 800 gig, which is a terabit, and it's working on 1.2 and 1.6 terabit technology. So that technology I'm predicting in 2040, it already exists in the core, and 20 years from now, it'll be cheap. The core will be a petabit. So your only choice as an operator is whether you're going to be rolling out the latest technology or whether you'll let your competitor roll it out.
Okay, fair enough. Well, John, we could spend an hour with you, but we have to move on to the next presentation. But thank you for this, and we'll see you again on the panel later on.
Great. Thanks, Alan, and thanks to everybody who came in to watch today.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want copies of your presentation, so we'll let you know about that. Okay. We're going to move on to our next presentation, which is from Ryan Nicometto, who is Senior VP and GM for Video and Broadband Solutions at Vecima. Ryan, thanks for joining us bright and early today as well.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. The weather in Europe is not very cooperative, but it's not in the U.S. either. So we're all, I guess, a bit of a gray day today. So first of all, I wanted to start out with the slide that talks really to our investor community. Typically, we use this one a lot, and candidly, it's a slide that sometimes I take a little issue with and I poke fun at because, as John noted, the applications that are really going to be driving the types of bandwidth our networks are capable of delivering, we don't know what those are. And if we've proven one thing, we're terrible at predicting what those apps will be, right? So 4K and 8K video, augmented reality, virtual reality, cloud gaming, you know, these things are what we know about today. What we worry about, what keeps us up at night is really the next killer app that we don't have visibility to yet, just over the edge of the horizon. And to that extent, we're really seeing operators around the globe deploy 10 gig PON primarily now, some moving to 25, some moving to 50. We're seeing DOCSIS 4.0 emerging. We're starting to hear talk of what's after DOCSIS 4.0, which we'll get into a bit here. And interestingly, this 10 gig service that we know we can deliver, customers are actually buying this, right? John talked about the 1 gig service take rate in the mid 30s from a percentage perspective. 10 gig service take rate, obviously we think would be much lower, but we're starting to see operators offering that at 40 or 50 euros a month, which is absolutely fascinating. So as that service starts to proliferate, we know that we'll see the next bandwidth intensive apps develop to take advantage of it. And that'll continue to drive this sort of 25% average or annual growth rate that we've seen in networks. And lastly, and super interestingly from the investment community perspective, we're seeing governments now spending billions of dollars to build out these networks. And Vecima, we ship both DAA DOCSIS service groups in the tens of thousands, and we ship 10 gig PON. These are two of our predominant product portfolios. And we've actually shipped more ports of 10 gig PON than we have DAA DOCSIS service groups, which is a fascinating statistic. And you look at where that funding has come from, it's really a lot of private equity investment, and there's a lot of government dollars that are really accelerating that spend. And while the spend is going to largely be in PON, really dig into those numbers and understand what's driving that spend. Of course, I think we could all agree it's the infrastructure cost. It's putting that glass into the ground and into backyards and into risers and flats, as an example. So when we think about how we're evolving our wireline access networks, very clearly the shift is away from analog hub sites and nodes into DAA with RPDs, RMDs, and in places, remote OLTs sharing those same node platforms. We're at the scale with DOCSIS where integrated CMTSs frankly can't keep up. We are increasingly needing as an industry to move towards vCMTS platforms. And then we were starting to talk about PON and even 10 gig PON platforms that were just deployed as legacy. These things, we have a vision at Vecima of a virtual PON network, which takes all the best things, everything we can virtualize essentially in a PON network, and that's largely control plane. We're starting to see efforts to move that to a unified management platform with other wireline access technologies. And one view of this is that HFC still has a lot of gas in the tank, and we can really align, if we choose to as an industry, our fiber offering with our HFC offering. Well, I know the big one is symmetric services. We'll talk about that, both anecdotally and a little bit more about what we're seeing in the market. But with HFC and fiber, we can really unify service offerings, management, and I would argue for an indistinguishable customer experience. Yeah, at some point, we need to stop. We have a marketing problem with cable, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So what's our vision, really, for the HFC network? And I would argue that this is one of our most valuable assets. And if you look at the spend required to go put a new access medium into the ground, and we're all doing it, totally understand that, and that will continue, there's an immense amount of value here, especially as we look past DOCSIS 4.0. So in the next 5 years, what we predict is very limited ongoing spend in integrated CCAP platforms, certainly analog optics, and maybe controversially, DOCSIS 3.1 CP. And a lot of folks may be saying, well, I'm just started deploying DOCSIS 3.1 CP. Hopefully not. Hopefully they've been deploying it for about 5 years now. But we're really starting to see the emergence of really turbo DOCSIS 3.1. That might be a Vecima term, I'm not sure. And also DOCSIS 4.0 CP, we believe will start to take the majority of market share here very, very soon. And also, of course, along with that, DOCSIS 3.1 RPDs and a VCMTS, which can take advantage of more than 2 OFDMs in the downstream. And then, of course, DOCSIS 3.1 RMDs, a 10 gig backhaul, a must. And we'll talk about the move to 25 gig optics here later. 1.8 amplifiers, even if you're not using all the 1.8 spectrum, absolutely, we should be deploying 1.8 amplifiers anywhere we deploy an amplifier today. And then we're starting to see the emergence of 4.0 RPDs as competition requires those. And so, speaking about DOCSIS 4.0, the drivers, the primary drivers, we've talked about competition, we've talked about capacity projections, and those may not be real capacity projections. Those could be, as John talked about, we have the ability and we can certainly market these 10 gig services even if we don't think they're needed from a capacity perspective. So it's a different view on capacity. It's almost competitive capacity requirements that will be driving DOCSIS 4.0. And then, of course, there are various views on early adoptance of the technology. And so as you look at this, one of the things that's interesting on the right-hand side here, we call this traditionally the candlestick chart. So your current DOCSIS 3.1 baseline, about 4 to 4.5 gig downstream and 1 to 1.5 upstream. So just implementing turbo DOCSIS 3.1 CPE with a high split, we can add 2 more OFDMs in the downstream. Now we're getting pretty competitive with 10 gig PON platforms in terms of usable bandwidth after overhead. FDX we can deploy and increase that upstream. And then when we get into DOCSIS 4.0 with high split or ultra high split, you can see here that in some cases we can actually beat 10 gig PON from a capacity perspective, assuming we had more than a 10 gig PON or more than a 10 gig LAN port, I should say, on the CPE device. So looking ahead for the next 10 years in HFC, we think that 4.0 RPDs will be widespread. We think that 25 gig backhaul, there'll be a necessity for that to emerge. Also emerging, we're starting to hear a lot of talk in the industry about DOCSIS 4.1 or 5.0. Is that 3 gigahertz? Is it more? And as part of that, leveraging that HFC network for non-DOCSIS use cases. So this is pretty fascinating. There's a lot of discussion about using the HFC network for 5G services. There's also a realization emerging that, you know what else we have in this network? It's not just a great medium for delivering broadband, it also delivers power, which is something you can't really do over a piece of glass. At least I haven't figured out how. And so we believe that achievable service offerings in a post DOCSIS 4.0 world, a 20 gig downstream, 5 gig upstream, totally achievable, and perhaps using that coax medium for other services as well, which is very interesting. Okay, in the fiber space, this is pretty simply, we'll replace the HFC network where fiber is technically and financially feasible. And so there, what we're looking at in the next 5 years is we should absolutely be limiting CapEx spend, obviously, for HFC and greenfield. If we don't have that existing infrastructure, why go deploy HFC? We would coach our operator partners to really stop investing in we'll say legacy GPON 2412 technology in favor of 10 gig PON, and we're largely seeing that transition. But it seems like there's a belief that GPON is still a little bit more cost effective than 10 gig PON, and while that may be true, you're going to pay for it in the long run. So we absolutely are coaching all of our customers deploy 10 gig PON exclusively. Start to look at these converged wireline controller architectures that are emerging from multiple vendors, where you have a remote or a rural deployment opportunity. Remote OLTs are proving to be an excellent tool in the toolbox to satisfy those customers. And then lastly, we're also seeing a realization that when you deploy fiber all throughout your network, sorry, that was my alarm telling me to wake up. When you deploy fiber all through your network, you do have a problem in MDU environments, and that the riser up to the units typically is not going to be fiber. That's going to be coax. It may be embedded into a wall. It may be very difficult and costly. And so really we're seeing a lot of operators who've bet heavy on fiber, transition there, starting to go back to DOCSIS for, and not the last mile, really the last floor, or the last multiple meters, I suppose. And so when you look at the next 10 years for fiber, 25 and 50 gig chipsets are, of course, emerging, and they're starting to be deployed. As part of that, obviously, we're going to need a 25 gig backhaul. And we're also seeing the emergence of coherent optics, which coherent is a fascinating topic we have and could continue to spend lots of time talking about in forums like this. And so we view the achievable service offering easily 20 gig downstream, and because of the symmetric nature of fiber, easily 20 gig upstream. And so when you start to look at a converged wireline access network, you can see OLTs and remote OLTs, MAC-PHY nodes, remote PHY nodes, all coexisting in an operator's system. And we actually have multiple customers that have deployed all of these technologies. And so the natural progression is to start to unify the control plane aspect of these. And the data plane architecture also looks rather similar across some of these technologies. But back to the control plane, at Vecima, we're developing unified controllers across all of these platforms and expect that these will be deployed in the next 12 months. So a couple of maybe controversial statements and thought-provoking questions. So I said earlier, I think that cable needs a new marketing message. So I think we do ourselves a bit of a disservice when we talk about these access mediums differently. If they can deliver mostly the same bandwidth, and we'll talk about the symmetric nature of one versus the other next, but we really have to think about what we tell our subscribers and our investors about our HFC network. And that symmetric message. So this is a bit anecdotal, so I apologize for this, but one of my guilty pleasures is to go on to my Facebook neighborhood group, right? And where I live in Madison, Wisconsin, I have Charter Communications providing excellent service, and in my neighborhood, AT&T has overbuilt Charter with fiber to the home service. And you would think that there'd be a lot of consumers, a lot of my neighbors flocking to AT&T fiber to the home, where I think they're offering up to a 5 gig symmetric service today. Charter can't quite do that, although they're feverishly upgrading their network now to be able to compete in those scenarios. So when I go observe kind of the back and forth discussion around, hey, who's deployed fiber to the home versus Spectrum, a lot of times you're finding that simply something like a $5 discount on the HFC network will maintain those subscribers. And so what AT&T started marketing with, which was symmetric bandwidth, is not really resonating, right? And at what point do you have enough downstream where your typical 10-to-1 ratio on the upstream, does the symmetric service not really matter anymore? And at what point then, if that does matter to the consumer, you just need to discount a little bit to take that competitive advantage away from the folks that are offering symmetric service. So this is another interesting thing that I think we need to track as we continue to kind of look at our service offerings and what we need to do to, as much as possible, unify these across different access platforms and make it seamless to our consumers. And then just to wrap up, at Vecima, we pride ourselves on 3 years running now for market share leader according to Del Oro in remote OLTs and remote MAC-PHY devices. And really, obviously, both of these technologies have the capability of delivering 10 gig services. And looking forward to helping operators really transform access networks, converge them where possible, and really drive more value for our consumers.
Okay, great, Ryan. Thanks very much. That was really informative. Just let me give you a quick question because we're starting to run a little late. How much life do you think DOCSIS has left in it?
I think John and I would agree. John said 10 to 20 years. I would be pretty bullish on the end of that. I would say 15 to 20 for sure.
Okay, so into up to 2040. Huh?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We look forward to hearing more as we get into the panel discussion. Thanks. That was a great presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's get into our first panel of the day. So I ask all the panelists to turn their cameras on. In this session, we will. It's all about access. In this session, we will focus on how European operators are upgrading their networks for greater capacity and higher broadband speeds, whether they are doubling down on DOCSIS over HFC, pivoting to PON, or over fiber, or both. Cable codes are seeking to make access networks as agnostic and interoperable as possible. So now let's take a quick look at our 5 panelists. Here they are. I'll introduce them and ask them to say a couple words about themselves in alphabetical order. First, we have Jan Ariason, who's CTO of Technetix. Jan, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks, Alan.
You can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'm Jan Aris. I'm the CTO of Technetix. I'm dialing in from the Netherlands. I think Ryan said also here we have bad weather, so I think it's happening everywhere. So, yep.
Okay, well, I'm glad the weather isn't stopping you from being here, so thank you. Right. Next, we have Anders Bloom. Anders is Senior System Architect, Broadband DCT for Broadband Networks at Tele2 Svenj AB. I think I said that wrong, but Anders, correct me if I'm wrong on that. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Alan. That's Tele2 Sverige AB. I don't know why I said Sverige. That's the Swedish for Sweden, actually. So sorry about that. Well, my name is Anders Blom, Systems Architect. Been working with DOCSIS for, I don't know, forever, it feels like. I think I started out in 1997, something like that. So anyway, DOCSIS has become my life for the past 25 years now. So I continue doing it, and thank you for having me.
Sure. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Colin Holland. Colin, as you know, is CTO of Bessemer. Colin, thanks for getting up at an ungodly hour once again for us and joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. I'm actually on the east coast of the U.S. today where it's sunny, so sorry for everyone else having bad weather. As with Jan and Anders, my entire career has been, the birth of broadband and forward, and looking forward to another, 20 years maybe of what we do here, and this will be an interesting panel. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. Thanks for being here. Next, we have Kevin Knowles, the Principal Architect at Cable Labs. Kevin, thanks for being with us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh yeah, thanks for inviting us. And so I've been in the cable industry since the late '90s with various operators as consulting, contracting, and then employed by a couple after that. And then also on the vendor side, focused on fiber for the last 12 years, pushing fiber to the premises, and the cable industry has been my life for quite a while now. So.
Okay, well, it's great to have you with us. And last but not least, we have David Whitehead. David is Senior Director of Broadband Solutions for Harmonic. David, thanks for joining us from across the pond.
Yeah, hi, Alan. Thanks for having me. I'm in England, and obviously here in England, we never talk about the weather. So won't be mentioned. Yeah, like everybody else, I've been in this sort of cable broadband space for the last sort of 25, 30 years. So seen a lot of changes, and it's good to be talking about the ones that are with us and still to occur. Okay,
well, thank you for being here. So we have a great panel. I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of intro slides so we can get to the panel discussion. As probably everybody knows what 10G is, but I just wanted to throw up this slide to go over quickly that it's a combination of technologies that will deliver internet speeds 10 times faster than today's networks, or at least at the time 10G was formed, and 100 times faster than what most consumers were enjoying, at least when this first came up back in 2019. Okay, so the two different main roads that the operators can take to 10G. There's the DOCSIS road and there's the PON road, as you can see here. And then within those two roads, there are two paths for each. There's a twin paths, DOCSIS paths to 10G, which are DOCSIS 4.0, two different versions of DOCSIS 4.0. Cable operators can either do extended spectrum DOCSIS, ESD, or they can do full duplex DOCSIS. So we'll get into that a little bit more during our panel discussion. Twin paths to 10G from PON. There's 10G EPON and there's XGS PON, and then there are various versions of PON beyond of the 10G PON. We might get into a little bit into 25G PON and beyond, as you can see here. Then my favorite slide here, talking about what European operators are doing to get to 10G PON, to 10G. As you can see here, different operators are pursuing different courses. We're going to hear a little bit more about that when we hear from Liberty Global and Vodafone later in our session. As you can see, it really depends on the country. Some operators in some countries are going full speed with DOCSIS to DOCSIS 4.0. A lot are pivoting to fiber, and some are doing a combination of them. In some cases, they're upgrading their HFC networks to higher orders of DOCSIS. In some cases, they're building fiber, particularly in greenfield areas. So it really depends on the market. So as a result, Cable Labs, as Kevin will tell us more about, as we talked about in the intro, is now tackling FTTP issues to help operators make that pivot to fiber and to higher orders of PON. So we'll hear more about that during our panel discussion. So with that, as I said before, you'll be able to download a copy of the slides whenever you want later on. So if you want to look at those in more detail. But let's get into our panel discussion here. So without further ado, let's get into the first question. How long can DOCSIS technology support cable's bandwidth needs, and how much time is left for DOCSIS? Let's start with Anders on that, and then go to David and Kevin and see who else wants to respond. Anders, what you're thinking about this?
Okay. All right. Well, it's a very easy question, actually. How much time is left for DOCSIS? It's exactly 14 years. And the reason for that is that's when I'm turning 67, and that's when I will retire.
Okay, fair enough.
No, actually, I think there are actually quite a long time left for DOCSIS. I mean, we are still having a lot of networks in the world on 3.0. 3.1 has been around for a very long time, and we are a full 3.1 network, but we are still migrating to a full DAA network, and that will take us still a couple of years, and then the next version 4.0, and I mean there are plenty of steam left. I mean, I get a little bit scared when I look at John's slides there about the capacity expansion needed in the next couple of years, 10 years, whatever. But then again, I mean, I've been scared every time I've seen his slides, and we don't see exactly that thing, because it's still the same way again, that how much are people willing to pay for all of this? Of course, there are people that really want these super fast speeds, and there are people that are actually willing to pay for it. But the vast majority of the people are not willing to pay for it. So as I see it, there are still a lot of steam left in DOCSIS. So I think they will be around for many years.
Okay, fair enough. David?
Yeah, I think Ryan did a great job of illustrating, how much life there is in DOCSIS. There's a paper released about 1.5 years ago by Moffett-Nathanson, who are a research agency, and they looked at the sort of average peak period downstream and upstream speeds that are currently being utilized in networks, and they extrapolated that out to usage, and then with compound annual growth rates actually looked at how much capacity the networks could support, and in their analysis, in the downstream, a 1.2 gig cable network, and admittedly not everybody's there at 1.2 gig yet, but that's certainly what everybody's aiming at in the short term. that had enough capacity till 2031 in the downstream. If you factor in a node segmentation, then that takes you, much further into like 2035. Similar story on the upstream. Today's mid splits probably get you to 2028, high splits to 2032. But then if you factor in node segmentations, which is business as usual for cable operators, that should be getting you into the sort of mid 2030s. So, a good 10 years. Looking then at potentially 1.8 gig in the downstream and higher upstream splits gives you more capacity, and it should take Anders through to retirement, I would hope.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, will DOCSIS take Anders to retirement?
I'll hold my tongue because I don't want to push Anders to retirement sooner than he needs to be there. I kind of look at it from a different direction, and I think Anders and David just both made a really good point. There's a difference between capacity and what the users are willing to pay for, and so we have to be careful about projecting what I'm just going to pick some random numbers here, like the 5% of users who are willing to pay for those speeds and qualities, projecting that onto the rest of the user base, because most of them are not actually willing to pay for that. And there's strong evidence shown in market research that says that they're not. In fact, they're more interested in things like reliability. With that said, I look at the lifetime of DOCSIS from a different perspective. I look at it from how long does it need to last us? And I say that because if today the cable industry said, we're going to focus on rebuilding our networks with fiber, overbuilding ourselves with fiber, not just greenfield, but overbuilding the existing DOCSIS network. If you pick, the largest cable operators in the world, and you compare that to what AT&T has been doing as far as building fiber, and I think last year they said that they built 60,000 miles of fiber, and that was the peak of what they've done so far. And you take that and you look at the largest cable operators in the world, it would take 10 to 15 years just to do the rebuild. So we have to make DOCSIS last at least that long. And can it? Absolutely it can. The network itself, the HFC, you've got plenty of spectrum available. It's a matter of updating the DOCSIS specifications or adopting new technology, whatever that might be, to access that spectrum. So absolutely, DOCSIS is capable of getting us into, if we want to say 2040, I'm not sure that I could support that from many perspectives because there's too many factors to really say that for sure. But at this point, we're 15 years from 2040, and so we have to make it work that long.
Okay, Jan and Colin, I wanted to get you in on the discussion too. Jan, how much life do you think DOCSIS has left?
I can only support what the guys are saying here. But I think the question is even different. I think the question is more how much long can coax survive? Because at the moment we are focusing on DOCSIS because DOCSIS will have maybe a 15 or 20 years lifetime. But there was also new articles coming out in the last months about new technologies, because at the end, DOCSIS has a limited dynamic range, and therefore you cannot go to those higher frequencies. But coax can easily go to 4 or 5 gigahertz. So if you have a different technology on those higher frequencies, then you can even push much further out than what we are talking about here. So new technologies can bring us much further even than that part. So therefore, I still believe in that coax will last for a long, long time. But I think there will be something else in parallel with DOCSIS over the coax in the future.
Okay. Colin, you get the last word on this one, if you want.
I think I agree with the other panelists. I think the big question that we're looking to answer and kind of following up with what John was talking about earlier, it's really a question. We talk about capacity and actually average usage rates. DOCSIS needs to follow the peak capacities, and so I think we're going to see this, obviously in the 10 gig era between, Turbo DOCSIS 3.1 and XGS 10 gig EPON, we have relatively, consistent capability there. We're not deploying that at a cable, but I think we're matching where the market wants to go, and we'll have that available and deployable very shortly here. But as we start to see coherent PON, as we start to see these roadmaps of where fiber is going, DOCSIS may not be able to keep up to those peaks, and that certain percentage of users may require us to have fiber out deeper in the network. As again, we don't know what the use cases are for that yet. But the second thing to think about it then is, DOCSIS will last, of course, for a very long time, supporting the rest of the network. And so I think it's this selective build and how each individual operator absorbs. And some operators, Kevin gave an example, Ryan gave his anecdotal example, a couple of North American examples, but some places in Europe we have ducts and fibers. We can move very quickly to an overbuilding situation relative to coax, maybe except for that last riser scenario. So yeah, DOCSIS, or as Jan says, and I will agree that there's things on the horizon where we're looking at other technologies. And maybe it ends up being called DOCSIS in the end, maybe not, but coax and HFC is going to be here for a very long time.
Okay, so we shouldn't set up the tombstone for it yet. Okay, very good.
No.
Thanks. All right, second question. Should European cable codes upgrade to DOCSIS 4.0, or will DOCSIS 3.1 plus, or extended, or whatever we call it, boost, or whatever we're calling it, will that be enough, and why? Let's start with Anders on that, and David, and go around the room.
All right. Well, should European operators upgrade to 4.0? Yes, they should definitely do that. The question is when. I think it's quite far ahead until we need to do that.
Okay.
DOCSIS 3.1 plus, or whatever invented all these fancy acronyms. DOCSIS 3.1, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's still specified up to 1.8 gig. So it's just actually 3.1. It's just another few OFDM channels. It's the same with the DOCSIS 3.0. When that came out, the original spec was 4.4 downstream channels and 4 upstream channels, and anything above that could just be added how much we ever wanted. And now we got 32 channels in DOCSIS 3.0, and now 3.1 is the same. There were never any limitations into OFDMs as far as I know. So for OFDMs, it's just 3.1, and it's a lot of bandwidth in that 3.1 systems. So I think the 3.1 will take us a very, 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 very long time. It's not until we really, really need a higher upstream speed that we need to go to 4.0, but 3.1 will take us a very long, long way.
Okay, thanks. David, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Anders is exactly right. We have a lot of customers who tell us that they've still not moved beyond DOCSIS 3 at the moment. They're not deploying OFDMs and OFDMAs because they haven't had the need for the capacity. And on the legacy ICMTSs, that's meant licensing to add those capabilities. So they've stayed back, and what they tell us is that the capabilities enabled by DOCSIS 3.1 are more than enough for them for the foreseeable future. At the same time, we've got a bunch of European operators who are already making plans to upgrade their networks to 1.8 gig, or they're potentially exploring full duplex if they think the move to 1.8 gig is a bit onerous. So it really does depend on, I think, the competitive threat that these operators face and what investment they need to make to actually ready themselves to compete with those alternative providers.
Okay, thanks. Colin, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think certainly, I think the important thing to think about is the preparations for DOCSIS 4.0. And so we see a number of operators, Europe, worldwide, thinking about, hey, if I'm touching the network, if I'm going out, if I'm touching taps, if I'm touching passives in my network, make sure I can upgrade those to things that are 1.8 gigahertz or beyond, to make sure we have, we don't want to go out and touch those again in the future. It's kind of touch it once and let it go. It's the same on the node side, making sure that we're deploying platforms that can support us beyond 1.2 gigahertz so that we have flexibility as an operator. Now, the timing, it's very specific to the operator and the market conditions. Do they need the peak capacities, especially in the upstream where they to go beyond a gigabit per second to really drive 4.0? we're not seeing desperation yet as a term, but certainly preparing yourselves for the future. And I think as the technology matures, as we start to see scale across the modem, RPD, and the amplifier part of the network, we'll start to see a lot more operators just doing it as part of regular business. But certainly just extending DOCSIS 3.1 as we already have it is enough for quite some time. Okay. Jan and Kevin, whichever one of you wants to go first on that.
No, yeah, I can respond. I fully agree with what Colin just said. I think if you have a network, for instance, 860 network or a 1 gig network, you need to upgrade. You will look for DOCSIS 4. You will make the step to 1.8 and step over 1.2. But if you have 1.2, and especially when you now look to the 5 ODM blocks, at the end you can have XCS-PON downstream, you can have GPON upstream. So there is still a lot of life in that at the moment. So it's not that you need to switch now. Yes, in the future, then if you want to continue this route, then maybe DOCSIS 4 is the option. If the line goes as John Chapman said before, that we need to have a terabyte in 20 years, then you suddenly you probably have to upgrade somewhere.
Right.
But at the moment, the DOCSIS 3.1, if you have a 1.2 gig network, you have a very competitive network with fiber.
Okay. Kevin, do you want to get your 2 cents in on this too?
I don't think I could add any more than what this team of experts has already said.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's move on to the next question. What are the pros and cons of overbuilding HFC networks with fiber, and how many subscribers do you think are really willing to upgrade to fiber right now? Let's start with Kevin and then go to David and Anders.
Yeah, this is an interesting question from the subscriber's perspective. I think there's this perspective, and I think we hit on it a few minutes ago. There's this perception that subscribers want to upgrade to fiber, that's the thing that's driving demand. I think there's strong evidence that subscribers are not necessarily buying fiber because it's fiber. They're buying fiber because they're not happy with their existing service for some reason due to perceived reliability or whatever. To make a projection on how many subscribers are willing to upgrade, that's a really hard thing to do, and I don't have evidence for that. From the perspective of pros and cons of overbuilding, I think the pros and cons are different depending on the particular operator and the economics and the competitive environment that they're operating in. So from a competitive perspective, I know we have members around the world and in Europe in particular, one I'm thinking of, that they're very, very effectively competing overbuilders with competitive fiber overbuilders with HFC, and doing that very successfully. In fact, they're outselling broadband service based on their HFC network against those fiber operators. Right. So, so those economics and competitive situations will drive a lot of that. So, pros and cons. I mean, there's the typical things we talk about. Some people will talk about fiber being more reliable, and again, I think there's strong evidence that fiber can be more reliable. It's not necessarily by out of nature. It's more about how you operate your network. Fiber is passive, and so it's going to have fewer components that are going to be likely to or possible to fail. But if you're not if you're not maintaining the network, which we've done in the HFC world very, very well, we've spent the last 15 or 20 years learning how to harden the HFC network and keep it up and going. If we don't transfer that knowledge over to the fiber, then the reliability is not going to be there. The other pros and cons, again, the competitive side of things. If you're in a competitive situation, you're going to need to do that. Overlaying your HFC network with fiber gives you some tools. In fact, again, we were just talking about that a minute ago. DOCSIS, well, Colin mentioned this, right? Colin said that we have to keep up with the peak speeds or the peak advertised rates is really kind of what we're talking about. And so there's going to be a point at which, maybe your DOCSIS network isn't able to keep up with that competitively. And so you come and overlay PON or fiber in place of that to to deal with those customers who do want to buy that product. Meanwhile, you're still serving your other customers with the HFC network, and it gives you another tool to extend the life of the HFC, extend or spread out your capex, your capital expenditures over time instead of having to do it all at one time. So I think those are the key pros and cons. I think they're less technical and more business issues than that. So.
Interesting. Okay, thanks, Kevin. David, do you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective on that?
Yeah, no, I do, and I think the drive to get a subscriber to migrate to another service provider is service unavailability from the provider they have today. And I think if services are provided reliably, there isn't the driver for the subscriber to migrate to, the new shiny fiber offering. And John made a really good point in his session this morning that, most service providers now have gigabit services, but the proportion of subscribers that actually take those services, it's the top 2 or 3%, and everybody else is happy with those middling kind of service offerings. So it's not flat out speed that drives subscribers to move. It's the performance of their existing networks and whether they feel the need to seek an alternative. And just as an aside, we had a conversation with a customer last week who's overbuilt part of their cable network with fiber. And the amount of subscribers they've seen proactively migrate from the cable service to the fiber service was only 5%. And wow. I think that speaks volumes about the reliability of their current service offering, though, rather than any negativity about fiber. But it's an interesting information point, I think.
Okay, thanks. Let's get an operator perspective on that. Anders, what are you seeing in terms of how willing subscribers are to upgrade from a HFC to fiber?
Well, I mean, in Sweden, it's a very, very different situation than the rest of Europe. We are 90% MDUs, and all MDUs are all tenants are part of a housing association. So we don't go directly to each tenant. We target the house, and when we get to the house, we get 100% penetration of the house, at least for cable connectivity. And actually, it is the landlords who approach us and say, "Hey, we have built the fiber network. Would you like to connect?" And either it's an open network infrastructure, or it's a fully monopolized situation where we get the entire cable. And so it's not really much our choice; it's their choice, and it's probably some kind of marketing choice where they believe that the house is more worth if they have fiber. I don't know, but I mean, from a service perspective, we've had 1.2 gigabit symmetrical services over DOCSIS for I don't know how many years, at least 3 years. So it's not really that it's a quicker service. Service is not what they should have. It's just it's a marketing thing. Of course, now when we look at even higher speeds to go like 10 gig and all that, it might be to think, well, only fiber can do that, but that's not true. DOCSIS can do that as well. So, and with our DAA migration, where we go a full remote PHY M+0 or maybe M+1, we prove to the landlords that we do the same thing on coax. So actually, we are winning a lot of properties back where they have had fiber for a while and now go back to coax because they think it's better.
No. Interesting. Okay, Colin or Jan, did you want to get in on this one too?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about overbuilding, I think John made a good point earlier. It's really about, we're not necessarily talking about any one operator overbuilding their entire network. Now there are some goals there. We're certainly seeing that in environments where there's funding that drives that. Whether that's broadband equity funding in some way to kind of cover the uncovered households or increase broadband penetration and availability. That's important, but at the same time, it's continuous overbuilding. So you want to take a portion of your network and build it every year, and really the advantage of that is when you look out 20 years, if you've done 5%. theoretically, hey, that's 100% of your network. You're overbuilt, and you're able to move away from HFC at that point when you need to. But I don't think that's one aspect of it. The probably when we talk about overbuilding, one thing to keep in mind, especially when we look at middle mile and how we continue to drive access out in the network, the powering and the capability of what we have available on coax, because we have that conductor. And if we don't have a conductor necessarily in a fiber network, even if we overbuild the fiber, we're likely to still keep some coax in. Maybe we use it for powering remote devices, but for the fiber side, maybe we use it for wireless, which we haven't talked much about wireless yet. I think there's lots there, and it's definitely going to matter and be specific to the operator. And but obviously we all know that slowly making changeovers is the way for us to go.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Colin. Jan?
I think everything has been said. The part that I also want to add to this is that at the end, overbuilding fiber is not generating your money, because at the moment you have a customer that pays for your coax service. So they're willing to invest, I don't know, $750 or euros into upgrading a customer to fiber, but he keeps on paying those 60 euros per month. It's a lot of money to invest by not generating more money. And that, of course, is at the moment is a problem for upgrading your network. And especially when I look to the Netherlands, I think if you look back 5 years ago, everybody said, you have to go to fiber, it's fast, it's better, and so on. But you don't need it anymore, because everybody is happy with the service they have. So why would you move? You don't need to repair what's not broken. So if it is good enough, so why would you walk away?
Sure. Okay. All right. Thanks.
And, Alan, if I may.
Sure, Kevin, go ahead.
So there's a question actually from the audience that I think is relevant here, asking about wireless, comparing wireless against DOCSIS and how they compete. And I think this is relevant because there's strong evidence that we're not competing for the, if you talk about the average subscriber, if you're talking about that 5% that Dave or Anders, I can't remember which one, mentioned, that 5% that goes to fiber. But if you're talking about the 95%, they're buying their service based on, is it reliable? Is it, am I happy with my experience, whether it's the network itself or with my customer service or whatever? There's strong evidence that is why that's the basis of their purchase, or even on cost. And they're willing to go to a lower bandwidth service to get higher reliability at lower cost. And the market research that we're seeing is that people are going to fixed wireless, right? They're going to fixed wireless, not the fiber. If fiber is available, they might do that too. But fixed wireless is a very strong competitor because of those factors, not because of speed, but because of reliability in the customer service experience.
Okay, so you're expecting to see fixed wireless continue to grow rapidly as a result?
I hope not, but yeah, it's definitely going to be it's definitely something we have to take into consideration as we compete in the cable market. Okay, fair enough. Next question for the group: how long can operators support 2 access networks, one HFC and one FTTP, and what are the costs of doing that? Anders, as an operator who is actually pursuing that right now, what's your thinking about that?
Well, so basically, we are probably, I don't know, 50 to 80% overbuilt already. Either it's our own fiber or it's someone else's fiber, but we are a service provider in that network. And I think the answer is quite simple, as long as it's profitable. Because the thing, if we would cut down the DOCSIS saying, okay, well, all right, we move directly to fiber, that will give all those customers an incentive to look at other technologies. So all these happy DOCSIS customers that are paying their fee to us every month are happy and don't bother us, and we don't bother them, and everything is just hunky-dory. Those people give money to the company, right? And while if we just tell them that, well, we're going to cancel your service, so we would recommend it to go to our fiber service, then they start looking, well, what can I do instead? I can go fixed wireless, I can take another provider maybe, or I can do whatever, or do I really need all this this bandwidth that I'm paying for? So I think it's about just not the disturbing the hornet's nest, really. Just as long as it works and as long as people pay for it, and we can go on forever.
Okay. David, do you think they can go on forever?
I can. I think the challenge you look at is with the operational support teams. And, you know, there's right. A few of us who are CMTS vendors who have been through that stage with a customer deployment where you're taking them away from their legacy CMTS to something that's new and slightly different. And operationally, that's a huge challenge. When you're looking at two completely different platforms with two completely different access technologies, that increases that challenge no end almost. So, you know, one of the things Ryan touched on it on his slides earlier, you know, one of the obvious advantages for an operator is if you can deploy both technologies using a single converged infrastructure, so that operationally the way you interact with it, the way you report, the way you get analytics back is consistent and familiar, then that reduces the overhead and it reduces the cost impact for operators. So I think that's one thing that we're trying to encourage cable operators to do is when you deploy a PON technology, do it using a familiar infrastructure so that even though the access technology is different, operationally, there's a lot of commonality and less to impact your operational teams.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Colin, how long do you think operators can support two networks?
Forever. I think we go back to to what John said. I mean, we talked earlier on this panel about the length of time it's going to take operators to fully replace coax. So they're going to be deploying both for a long time. Operators also is a different term. I think it's evolving, right? We're seeing the evolution between open access and kind of new models of Netco and ServCo that are especially happening in Europe. We're seeing differences. So it matters what you think of as an operator. The idea of a converged cable operator that's actually, you know, running both service and the infrastructure. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to support both for a long time. I think when you think of serving companies, do you care? I mean, if you're riding over top of another network, whether that's, you know, infrastructure, or whether you're providing gateways at the home to do that, you know, certainly you can support it. You're building on top of both of those networks as an operating operator, we'll call it. To me, that's a bad term, but I think the important thing is really just how do you get it to where you have to go, and the costs are very similar to what David says. You know, in the end you need to converge the back office. You need to look at it from the overall operations perspective, like it's just delivering IP Ethernet service to the home. And however you have to do that to get the metrics that are specific to the operational needs. We don't care about P&M from knowing pre-equalizer coefficients in a fiber network, but we care about the quality of service. We care about how the bits are being delivered. We care about certain things that will give us information about how we maintain the network. And those are unique and separate, but the rest of the things about the subscriber service, latency, looking at how they're actually operating in the network, those can be common. And I think we have, as an industry, we have to pull those together into a common platform.
Okay. Kevin, what's CableLab's perspective on this, or your perspective on this?
I think everybody's hitting the key points, and operational costs are the key one, right? Or kind of the key topic. A friend of mine has talked about bucket trucks as the measure for things, right? So anything that you do that increases the number of bucket trucks that you have to buy and operate is, you know, it's increasing your cost. You have to kind of look at it that way. So, you know, David and Colin both mentioned that converging the back end system, that's important. That's one of the things we're working on here at CableLabs. Of course, we've had DPoE for years to make EPON look like DOCSIS from a provisioning and operations perspective. We're working now with our common provisioning working group to do a better job of adapting GPON or ITU PON into that sort of an environment and bring in our interoperability there. We've got our optical operations and maintenance working group, which is also touching on the that operations aspect and the monitoring and the metrics part of it, just like we did with PNM in the DOCSIS world. So we've got those efforts going on. But again, how long can operators support 2-access networks? For as long as they can maintain the cost and profitability that goes with it. If the operational expenditures exceed, what is practical and what's profitable, they're going to stop doing it, and that's when they make that decision point.
Okay, thanks. Jan, did you want to get any comments in on this?
I think it's not a technical question. At the end, it is, especially as the guy said, it's a business question. As long as it is profitable and you can run 2 networks parallel, why would you not do that? So it's not a technical. And now, especially now, because you have your RPDs, you have your OLTs, you have the node locations. It's all data till a certain point, and that from that moment on, you have your last access part to come into the home. It's not that we had like in the past where we have analog optics and all these things and so on. It's all data to a certain point, and from that moment on, we can split it into fiber customers and into coax customers. So, and as long as that's profitable, they will keep on doing it. Okay.
All right. We're starting to run low on time, but I wanted to get this one question in because I know that there's a lot of industry buzz about that. What right now is holding up the deployment of DOCSIS 4.0? Is it the modems? Is it the RPD chipsets? Is it other equipment? And what can be done about it? Let's start with Anders and see who else wants to respond on that.
Well, I mean, it's not a big secret really in the industry that there is a limited amount of chipsets available, and it's not easy to get a hold of them, so to speak.
Right.
So I would say that's one of the limitations. But that's not really the big one. The biggest limitation is really that in order to go to 4.0 for real, you need to be DAA. So if you don't run a DAA network with full RPDs, N plus, I would say 1 or 2, maybe 3, but not more than that, it's going to be hard for you to do 4.0. So I think it's really about the migration to DAA first, and then when you're fully done with that, 4.0 is just going to be like anything else has been for the past 20 years. It's going to be there, and you can run it. So I think it's more that you need to go to DAA first.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Anders. David?
No, totally agree with Anders. Without DAA, there is no DOCSIS 4. So that's the prerequisite for any operator that's looking to invest in their HFC network and grow their capabilities. What I would say is obviously full duplex DOCSIS. Comcast have done quite a few news stories about their deployments in North America, and that seems to be progressing at speed. I think extended spectrum, we're not there yet with the amplifiers from what I can see, but we would be expecting the RPD technologies to be available sometime later this year. And certainly modems are available now with large OFDM counts to support DOCSIS 4. So the technology is almost there, but again, to back up Anders' point, DAA is the building block for everybody when it comes to a planned migration to DOCSIS 4.
So it's those RPD chipsets. Anybody else want to chime in on this one?
What David said about the amplifier, I think the stuff is there. I think we have the amplifiers, we have the passives. It's all there. I think it's we come back also down to the network. At the moment, it's also a decision to be made. If you have a network that is doing what you needed to do, like a 1 gig symmetrical service, are you already want to invest in that step? I do believe that Vodafone Ziggo wants to make that move in 2025. They said that they will slowly start to go to DOCSIS 4, and that probably will be the first country in Europe that will go to DOCSIS 4 in this area. It's a big rebuild. Let's be honest. You have a lot of amplifiers, you have passives, you have it in the network. And I think, as David said in the past, Comcast is doing FDX. And FDX had the big advantage that you didn't have to replace the taps over it, what you had to do with ESD, for instance,
right.
to 1.8. But all of that stuff is now not valid anymore, because the taps now, you don't need to replace the back boxes. You can do that that way. And you have on the other side, you have the ESD. You can go to 1.8. So at the end, it's just a business decision now.
Okay.
So it's not really, and I understand what they say. Yeah, we need the RPDs, but the RPDs will not work if you don't have a network behind it, and that has to be rebuilt. And that's time. It's just time.
Okay. Colin or Kevin, do you want to chime in on this one as well?
Sure, why not? I don't mean to be flippant, but orders help. So we take POs. No, but I think that's part of it. I think we have a set of operators who are stepping forward on the technology side to get access to the silicon and move that forward, and that's happening across the industry. It's happening across multiple geographies. It's just taking time for that to get there. Okay. And I think we're seeing, we're deploying and we'll be shipping into production 1.8 gigahertz nodes this quarter. So the product is there, and it's getting there this year. It's just there isn't as much desperation to go deploy it that we've talked about this entire panel. Right. We have a great network today. We need to be ready for the future. We're not the drive is there to just touch it once and keep it for a longer period of time. But the DOCSIS 3.1 we're deploying, the DAA that the operators are deploying is serving. And so it's this combination of all of the equipment readiness, and operators need to have it out yesterday. And they're not as desperate as some of us might like to deploy as early as they can, but it's coming.
Okay, fair enough. We'll see. Kevin, you get the last word if you want it.
Again, this panel is full of experts, and I think they've covered this pretty well. I don't think I could add anything more.
Okay, fair enough. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think we covered a lot of ground here, so please join me in thanking our panelists here out there. And we will be back in 15 minutes. There should be another link that was sent to you for session 2 for the second half. So thank you, panelists, and we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan.
Everybody.